Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Marion Fulker. I'm the CEO of Committee for Perth and also the project manager of Filling the Pool, one of the most exhilarating projects I've done in my career. And you'll hear from our lead researcher, Dr Terry Fitzsimmons, about that project in detail. Can I acknowledge that we're meeting on Whadjuk country as part of the Noongar Nation and acknowledge their elders past and present. Today we're going to examine the very vexed issue of gender equity, with a specific focus on our Filling the Pool project. And Terry and I did 6PR with Gary Adshead this morning, and he nearly trekked into so many minefields you could see his mouth moving at a different pace to his brain. And we had half an hour on air. It was well promoted as an issue. We got, I think, very good airtime. And as we were coming off air, there was a queue of callers from women who wanted to get into the conversation and certainly to ask questions. And Terry and I were a bit frustrated by this because this would have been a great opportunity to air some of the issues and certainly hear from people's own experiences. And I think it was mainly because people really wanted to get an understanding of what the issue was before they started talking about their own personal experiences. So today you're going to hear about the project, about Terry's research that led to this project, and I hope the Q&A is incredibly lively. We've got some wonderful guests here today, so can I acknowledge Kerry Sanderson, AO, who's the chair of our Perth Alumni, which is our Ambassadors program. A big thank you to our sponsors for this particular project, Shell Australia, the Department of Local Government and Communities, Wally Parsons, Westpac and EY, along with our two most influential supporting partners on this particular topic, AICD and CEDA. And Liz and Suzanne, thank you very much for being here. Well, welcome to the members of our steering committee, and you'll see their faces flying through the slides. And Michael Schock from Shell, who's the chair of the project steering committee, will give the vote of thanks later today. And I think he would agree with me that the project group has just been such a supportive environment in which to have quite a difficult series of conversations. We've always been incredibly respectful of each other's opinions, the big diversity of views amongst us, and we're all very much focused on problem solving. Can I also acknowledge that we have a number of local government and state government representatives in the room. So Gail McGowan, the Director General of Department of Planning, thank you very much for coming, Gail. And the Mayor of the City of South Perth, Sue Doherty, who's a regular at the Committee for Perth events, and the Commissioner from the City of Canning, Linton Reynolds. Filling the Pool started in recognition that Perth was not utilising its female talent to its maximum, that people in decision-making and influencing roles were mostly male, mostly middle-aged, mostly white. And Committee for Perth has a big diversity agenda, but we really felt that we needed to start with 51% of the population in women, and then we will move on to other diversity issues. Filling the Pool is a 2-year project. We're 1 year into it, and it has been an incredible journey to date. And I don't think you will be disappointed when you hear what Terry has found so far through the interview process. So how did it start? Back in 2001, we brought some women together to discuss some of the issues that we were reading about in the media, certainly aware of at an individual level, and hearing more at a collective sort of a series of frustrating conversations. We brought these women together, we mapped out what the issues were, and we started scoping a project that would not only identify what the problems were, but also look at the solutions. And we built a project that was so big and so difficult to do, we kind of threw our arms up in the air and had a bit of a rethink. So in the meantime, while we were having this rethink about what was really important to focus on, I was reading anything I could lay my hands on gender equity. And I read an article which featured Terry and his thesis work, which focused on the characteristics of success of CEOs. That very day, I went back to the office and I contacted Terry, and within weeks I was sitting in a meeting room at the University of Queensland, marvelling at how his research had found that there is a stark difference in the success between genders. Every project, every issue needs a champion, and I came back to Perth to tell Michael Schock at Shell that we had found our man. And with Mike's support, a scope of work was agreed to, and Shell underwrote 75% of the research cost. Once we had a live project, other funding and supporting partners came to the table, and in June last year we held the media launch with Anne Pickard, the then country chair of Shell, to launch the project. Since then, so many of you in this room have taken part in the research program through the interview phase. What you have provided Terry and his colleague, Professor Victor Callan, is a rich source of information that will help corporates and others to keep a strong pipeline of women in the organisations throughout their careers, as well as providing very useful tips for women themselves on how to grow and prosper in Perth, the third largest centre of corporate control in the country. Ultimately, we want more balance in successive generations, not only in terms of gender, but also in ethnicity. However, starting with this 51% issue, we thought we'd better get cracking. I know you will enjoy Terry's recap on his initial research. Everyone who's heard it to date has been absolutely fascinated with it, and then, as I said, he'll give you a sneak peek into the findings. The next 12 months will be about Terry writing his report and us drafting a series of recommendations for women as well as for corporates and socialising those very broadly. We're now working on a 1 June 2015 release date, and there's a lot of work to be done between now and then. Filling the Pool has given the Committee for Perth a new model of undertaking research projects by seeking funding partners as well as making a contribution through all of our members' collective membership funds with us. Membership of the Committee for Perth is one of those things that not every corporation in Perth is going to be up for. You put your money into a combined pool, you have research undertaken, and you find solutions to make Perth a better place in which to live and work. But for each of you who is a member and representing a member company here today, a very sincere thanks from the board. To introduce you to Dr Terry Fitzsimmons, he's a chartered accountant with 25 years' experience. He's currently a postdoctoral research fellow at the University of Queensland's Business School, researching in leadership transitions, and he tells me he's got a promotion which will come into effect in February next year, so congratulations. Terry's also a management consultant who has worked with many of Australia's largest firms, an international professional speaker engaged in the area of gender equity and inclusion, and is a lecturer in the areas of leadership, strategy, gender diversity and management. He has served as national and state presidents for not-for-profit bodies, as well as being a director on listed company boards both in Australia and overseas. Terry's thesis, Navigating CEO Appointments, Do Australia's Top Male and Female CEOs Differ in How They Made It to the Top?, uncovered a surprising difference in the success factors between male and female CEOs. To discuss this and the early findings on the Filling the Pool research project, please make Terry welcome.
Well, welcome and thank you for having me here. What I want to do is take you through two things. First of all, the context or the background of how we devised the project, and then to give some early discussion of the findings. So I think one of the major differences between this project and my thesis was the ability to access firms and to be able to speak to the people that are at the heart of this issue. And certainly without the support of our key sponsors and other key organisations, that wouldn't have been possible. When you do hear the findings, one of the, I guess, the most amazing things for me as the researcher is that it is such a broad cross-section of Perth. Every major firm, from accounting, law, architecture, engineering, mining, resources, everyone's participated, and for that we're very grateful as researchers. This isn't a problem that just confronts Perth. It's a global issue, and it has been since going right back to hunter-gatherer society. The issue certainly presents itself differently in each different country, but the issue of women leaving in droves in their early 30s is one that confronts every Western nation on the planet. Australia just happens to be a little bit further behind than the other countries in the Western world. What's different nationally? Well, WA stands out as having the highest gender pay gap. While that has decreased by, I think, 1.8% in the last year, it's still at 24% and well ahead of all of the other states. Queensland being the second in terms of not having great numbers, and they sit at 21%. What's also apparent from looking at the Dun & Bradstreet data is also the number of women in key management positions in Western Australia is lower than every other state in Australia, and quite significantly so. The Committee for Perth brought us on board simply because those statistics are quite disturbing from an economic perspective in terms of the underutilisation of talent. The big question is there something unique about WA that causes it to differ so markedly from the other states? And of course the obvious question is, is it just because of the resources sector? That was one of the things coming into this. Certainly a question I wanted answered. Is it just the same things that we know about, but heightened in some way, or is there something unique about Perth and WA? And I think it's a bit of both, which we'll hear at the end. So a bit of background, certainly in terms of the CEO work that I did. This whole idea of it being a pipeline issue, certainly want to dispel that myth very quickly. Women have represented degree qualified work entrants in greater numbers than men since 1985. So we're approaching 30 years ago, certainly more than a generation. And women represent more than 40% or 45% of MBA graduates. And MBA is taken as a proxy measure for those that have ambitions to executive roles. And so that's been since 1995. So again, 20 years. To put that in perspective, 20 years, if you come out of university at say 21 or 22, 20 years on, you're about 42. The average age of a CEO is 45. So it's not a pipeline issue. This goes back many years. And the proof's in the pudding. Only 2.4% of ASX 500 CEOs are female. Across all ASX companies, if you take Gail Kelly out of the mix as being a bit of an outlier, our people here from Westpac, women control less than 1% of the market capital on the stock exchange. So even though 2.4% is appalling, 1%'s a hell of a lot more appalling. And the relative number of women CEOs has barely moved in the last decade. In fact, just as a fun little exercise, I projected when, based on current trend, would women gain equality, and the year is 2358. So maybe we need to do something differently. I had a very elderly chair in my CEO research actually ask me, so why is this a problem? So at the time I really wasn't equipped to answer it, but I can certainly answer it now. There are three reasons why it's a major problem. One is it's obviously a social issue. If there's some kind of force out there that prevents one group from being able to participate as fully as another. It's certainly a diversity issue when the people representing us, whether it be government, whether it be private sector, don't actually represent proportionally the same interests as the leadership cohort do. And I think from a business perspective, and probably most critically from a business perspective, it's a major economic issue. And it's a matter of common sense. If we're only talking 2 to 3% female CEOs and we're talking 97% male CEOs, then just imagine the difference in terms of talent that's being wasted. So the 98th percentile of performance versus the 3rd percentile of performance. And a few organisations have actually mapped this out and looked at it, McKinsey being probably the most notable in the States. And the statistics are, I mean, we can all have a look at that. 55 to 60% degree qualified entrants being female, 52% of those being professional females. Yet, within 15 to 18 years, that number declines to just 10%. And that dotted line represents line roles, which are where most CEOs are appointed from, and that's only 6%. So it's no surprise that then it declines to about 3.5% for CEOs. McKinsey labelled this the stupid curve. What they were saying is, what's the economic loss from the wasted talent from that difference between men and women in those levels? And McKinsey came up with a huge number in the US in terms of GDP foregone by not utilising this talent. It's been done in Australia. It's anywhere between $8 to $14 billion a year is lost because we can't resolve this issue. Now let's put that in perspective. As a country, we've been having a debate about the budget and budget deficits for the last year. If this problem was solved, the GDP generated and the tax base created from that would solve the budget problem within 2.5 years. That's the kind of quantum we're talking about. So the gender pay gap, as I was saying, West Australia 24%. Nationally, we're now at 17.1. So the curve has turned a little bit since that graph. It was 17.5 2 years ago, so it's declined by 0.4%. Why? WGEA and formerly EOWA, couldn't really tell us what was causing that, though they suspected it was the resources boom. It's interesting that the curve has turned now that the boom is over. But still, a 0.4 move in 2 years, given the decline in the mining sector, there's certainly a lot more going on in the gender pay gap than the resources boom. That's for certain. So when people ask me, well, how is it possible when you're sitting in a room with a man and a woman in an equal position to have them earning 24% different? It's not as simple as that. When these numbers are taken and they're collected, it is full-time earnings, so it's not part-time, it's nothing to do with time spent in the workforce. They are male and female equivalents in full-time earnings. When you break it apart, the biggest factor is the fact that men tend to occupy more highly paid industries, so certainly the mining and resources sector, very highly paid, very high proportion of men. That explains about 25 to 35% of that difference. Because there are so few women in senior roles, which are more highly paid, that level within the hierarchy can explain another 15 to 20% of the gender pay gap. And there's an interesting phenomenon. If you even have an organisation that's very rigorous with its pay and has banding, levels within bands, when you do the analysis, men tend to sit at the top of the bands and women tend to sit at the bottom of the bands. And that accounts for another 10 to 15%. The rest is unknown, but most researchers say it's because you're female. There's that 30 to 50% that's just not explained by those factors, and to date still hasn't been. In terms of the board context, I grabbed this slide from Susan Vinicum, not because of the statistics in it, but to show one particular point. But I certainly think the AICD need to be congratulated on bringing Australia up to, I think it's 18.1% board representation. That's phenomenal in such a short space of time. But that's not why I've got this slide up here. One of the questions that came out when I was presenting over in the UK was what was happening in Norway, where they've had quotas on boards. They reached the 40% women on boards target exactly on time. And the question was, so what's happened to female representation as far as CEOs and executives has gone in that period, given that we've got this increase from, I think it was 8% to 40% in a matter of 5 years. So what's happened at those other levels? And the answer was nothing has happened at those levels. And so it caused a bit of a debate about, well, how can that be possible? We've had this massive intervention, high uptake by firms, we've reached these targets on boards, why didn't it happen for CEOs and executives? And I guess probably the brutal answer is that wasn't legislated. That's probably what the outcome of that debate was. So what I find really interesting, being a male researcher probably, is why there's such a lack of urgency around this issue federally. Women gained suffrage 112 years ago, yet we have one woman in a 20-person cabinet. And as I was told, and I've included it in the brackets because it came up at a women in leadership function, Afghanistan have more women on their cabinet than we do. Interesting, but true. And the other interesting fact is in 1973, one of the very first acts of the Whitlam government was to actually abolish the mandated gender pay gap. Back before 73, women were not allowed to earn more than 75% of what a man earned. Crazy stuff, but true. So the Whitlam government abolished that 25% mandated gender pay gap, but here we are 40 years later and we're still sitting at 24% in WA. So there's something going on. So what do we know? I heard the expression again at a conference, look, this has been done to death. We know all of this. I totally agree. We do know all of this. We do know the factors that cause this. It's been researched to death. We've known this for 20 years. It still hasn't made any difference. So what are the things that we know? Well, we know pink and blue. We know we raise our boys and girls differently. Are we surprised then that that has an effect later in life? I'll talk more about that later. There's certainly social expectations around what roles men and women should undertake in society. Whether it's the role of a mother or whether it's the role you play in the workplace. We know that direct and indirect discrimination still occur. And I know from actually running focus groups with female graduates that these things are still going on. The division of labour at home still causes major issues, and in fact I think it's underplayed and understood the exact amount of problem that causes, and certainly when we get to talking about some of the results from this study as well as the CEO study I did, that's one of the major factors. The double bind, that men can get away with both soft and hard leadership behaviour. Women, depending on their industry, find it very difficult and they're confined to a narrow range. Either they're a ball breaker or they're too soft. There's no in between. Whereas men can tend to get away with that. It does depend on what industry, but it's known as the double bind. We also know that mentoring plays a very critical role in female career progression, far more so than men. And it's really in terms of building leadership and self-confidence that boys tend to get through their socialisation as boys, and I'll talk again about that later on. It's still the case, both in the US, the UK and Australia, that women need to move more often to obtain promotions, and they have to wait longer in each position before being promoted. There's no doubt from the role models that we have, even in Australia, whether it's Gail Kelly or the former Prime Minister, that it is possible to reach the top. So the glass ceiling has been broken, but it's still labyrinthine in terms of getting there. And there are other expressions such as the glass cliff, where women will often have to take far more risky positions in order to get ahead. We know that there's a differential value placed on flexible roles and how we view flexible roles or part-time roles, and we still have differential pay for industries dominated by women. It's no coincidence that the lowest paid sectors in our economy are dominated by women. So we know all of that, and I don't think there's anything in there that we haven't known for 20 years. So one of the things we did with the original study was we were looking at, well, what gets both men and women ahead in terms of what are the capitals that they have to acquire during their career to get to the top. And those 6 were the ones that popped out. When we were doing the study and we had a look at the literature and all of the work that's been done, we identified over 2,000 studies. Alice Eagley and Linda Carley had compiled a list, 2,300 it is, studies that support all the things that we've already known. That had me intrigued because I really, you wonder probably why as a guy doing gender research, it just had me absolutely fascinated. Well, if we've got 2,300 studies, it has been done to death, why does this problem still persist? There's got to be something we don't know. So one of the things that you turn to when you're trying to put this sort of thing together is you've got to have a model. It's just too huge to try and figure this stuff out yourself. And fortunately, we came across Pierre Bourdieu, a crazy French guy, who came up with this terrific way of viewing the world. He said, if you've got a problem of intergenerational disparity or inequity, you need to know 3 things about that sector of society. The most important is the field of power. Who is it that sits at the top of that and enforces the rules? Who determines who progresses, who succeeds and who doesn't? And who writes those unwritten rules in any given sector of the population? So that's the first thing you need to know. The second thing you need to know is what is valuable. What do they hold as valuable in a person in terms of career capital? You need to know what's valued and how to acquire it. And the third thing then is how do you acquire it? Where does it come from? And he coined the term habitus, but really habitus just simply means the sum of your life experiences. And if that sum of your life experiences happens to include the capitals that are found as being valuable, then you're more likely to progress into a field. The last thing, which isn't how, it's more about what happens if you don't, is symbolic violence. And he coined that as a term as what happens to keep people out. And it might, he viewed it as being violent, but it's really about discrimination, but it's also about how roles are described, how people are promoted, what processes allow access into career development roles. So symbolic violence is done to those people who, and they probably don't even know it's happened to them, about when they don't possess the capital in the field. So using that model, we devised a series of studies. The first one was the field. So in Australia, the corporate field, who dominates that? Well, obviously sitting at the top of the food chain is ASIC. So we looked at, well, what did the chairman and the deputy chairman of ASIC say to industry for the 10 years prior to the study? For that 10-year period when they were addressing industry and speaking to chairs and businesses, what were they saying was important in CEOs? Basically, what they said was this pretty simple stuff. The breadth and depth of industry experience of a CEO provides the board with the greatest chance of profitability and the greatest chance of avoiding prosecution if something goes wrong. So remember that, the breadth and depth of industry experience. The message was very, very clear. The second and the third study, we spoke to all of the managing partners of all of the executive recruitment firms across Australia working in the CEO recruitment space. And then we chose 30 ASX 200 chairpersons to verify the results. That's where those 6 capitals came from. But a critical, very critical, 7th capital emerged, and that's social capital. Now, I don't expect you to be able to read that. I can't. But the point of this one is that there are 2 circles. One is the circle of visibility of the board, and the other is the circle of visibility of the CEO. You can have all of those capitals in spades. You can be the best person for the role on the planet, but if no one knows it, you're never going to get the role. So there's a critical role about relationships and being visible in your industry and your sector. It's not good enough to be good at your job. You have to be known to be good at your job. And that's where self-promotion, self-efficacy comes in and is so critical. So the last study was probably, from my point of view, the most interesting, and we took 30 ASX female CEOs and then we matched them to 30 males by market capital and by industry, as much as you can compare apples with apples. What that did was we produced a life narrative. We said, tell us your story from birth to CEO, and we were able to compare the two. And so this is what came out. One of the things we weren't expecting is we were really focused on career. We weren't really looking at childhood, but Pierre Bourdieu said you really need to look at the childhood habitus. Well, I'm really glad we did, because the female CEOs were amazingly similar in their backgrounds. All but one had shared an upbringing in a small business family where they'd learnt stewardship and strategy in terms of acquiring some of those capitals. All but 2 had suffered major trauma in childhood between the age of 8 and 15 that they had overcome with the help of friends and family, which had given them a sense of resilience and self-efficacy. What were the boys doing? Well, the boys were out blowing up frogs and going hiking and camping, and they were a traditional family. Dad was professionally employed, mum stayed at home. Totally different, really interesting. All of the boys, not one of the male CEOs I spoke to, had not been the captain of their football team. Not one. Very interesting. Yet very few of the female CEOs had been captain of any team in their childhood. So you've got some interesting stuff going on in terms of what the boys are getting in career-related capital and what the girls are getting in childhood. So where does that take us? Into adulthood, the men had replicated their childhood. Nearly all the male CEOs had children and stay-at-home wives. Yet the females, all of their husbands worked. So the complete opposite. I was surprised at the number of the female CEOs who had children. 23 of the 30 had children. And I thought, well, that's very interesting. If all of their husbands are working full-time as well, who's got the greatest share of domestic labour? All of the female respondents identified themselves as having the primary carer role. So even the most successful women in Australia, in terms of corporate CEOs, had less time to spend on their careers than their male equivalents. It was also interesting being able to speak to them and ask what had happened to their peers and colleagues from university and friends along the way. And one of the consistent comments was that most of them had been forced to choose between family and career at some point, and they chose their family over their career. The female CEOs that I'd interviewed said that that had never occurred for them. They hadn't had a circumstance where they needed to choose. And a lot of that was about luck, about children not being sick, about parents being able to support them and different things like that. They also were able to share a lot of their domestic responsibilities, even though their husbands worked. They still had husbands that they were able to share those responsibilities with. And they're quite regimented about how that would work and quite negotiated about how that had worked. But nonetheless, the husbands were there to actually help with the female's career. Another interesting thing is virtually all of the female CEOs with children had had them either very early, so in their late teens, early 20s, or much later in their career. I don't think there was one of the female CEOs that had had children at mid-career point. Again, very interesting in terms of critical timing. None of them had taken any more than 6 months away from their career while having children or after having children. So again, they had more time to accumulate capital in the workplace. The time created, what did they do with this extra time? Well, they used it mainly to maintain past networks, past relationships with people that they'd worked with. and also to serve on industry bodies and industry associations. So they chose to spend that extra time on accumulating social capital, is basically what, if you remember that diagram about the circle, that was what set them apart. That spare time was used to acquire social capital. What was very interesting, and a major difference between the men and the women, is virtually all of the female CEO appointment opportunities had arisen from those networks. For the men, it was different. It was mainly industry work and being known within the industry. Key early promotion opportunities arose from management recognition of success. Nearly all of the female had very strong sponsors and mentors very early in their careers, and they had identified them as being talented and particularly moved them into line role experiences. That is, took them out of where they were and put them into profit and loss roles rather than support roles. And again, that's key in that most CEOs are appointed from line roles rather than support roles. What was interesting, though, on the other hand, was that very few of the men attributed their success to mentors, yet all of the women attributed their success to mentors. Yet when you look at their career journeys, the men and the women had very similar stories to tell about the role other people played in their career. So what does that tell you? I don't know. Men just expect it, it's part of the game, that's just normal, right? Whereas women recognise the contribution of others because perhaps that's not the norm in career development. Again, a comment that was made from the female CEOs about why their peers had stayed out of the workforce was that they'd stayed out for too long and there'd been a decline in confidence about being able to re-enter, about currency. And so they were very clear, and that idea of them staying out for very short periods of time was about making sure that they stayed relevant. And even when they were out, up to 6 months, they still maintained contact with their firms, they still maintained contact with their industries, they took the opportunity to do further study to maintain that currency. So very rare for this group of CEOs, as you'd probably expect, to have to apply for more senior positions. They were usually offered those positions. But for both groups, where they were confronted with blockages, they were very quick to identify those, bring them to the attention of management, and if no one was listening, just to move on, not to keep bashing their head against a brick wall. They were very quick to move. One difference between the men and the women, though, the men were quite purposive about that. They were looking 2 steps ahead, whereas the women were more opportunistic about it because there probably were fewer opportunities coming their way. They grabbed what they could. That, though, tended to take them outside of their industry. That opportunity was very rarely within their industry. So the female respondents, the female CEOs, had moved outside of industry far more often than the men. But if you go back to what the chairs and deputy chairs of ASIC were saying, breadth and depth of industry experience, and then you're saying, or I'm saying, that these women are moving outside of their industry and moving across industries to get positions, then all of a sudden you can see what is valued by the field isn't coming through in the habitus of the female CEOs. So leadership ability for both men and women was enhanced informally through close association with usually male. I think there was one female CEO had a female mentor or sponsor early on, mainly male. So that meant that the females, to maintain their authenticity of leadership, to be themselves and not adopt a male persona, had to look for female role models or cues outside of themselves. What was interesting is, again, going back to childhood, most of the female CEOs had a crazy aunt. The yachts and the pearls and doing different things. Even though their mum was helping in the small business, she was still helping with the small business, helping the husband. Whereas most of them had an aunt or a grandmother who was doing exciting and really different things. And what it was showing them is the world could be different. There were other pathways than following what their mum had done. Again, don't expect you to read this, but in the first study we identified 36 points of difference that women face that men don't. And each one of those points dints the pipeline from 55% down to 3%. So what have we found here with this study? Well, if you go through and you listen to the narrative of the female CEOs in the first study, there were different mechanisms that supported them in being able to develop career capital. And in fact, if you distill it down, there were 4 pillars, 4 things that allowed them to do that. Where they needed them, they were able to get access to childcare facilities. So they were accessible, they could use them for long periods of time, and they were affordable at that stage of their career. One of the things we've found in Western Australia is that the childcare system isn't as robust as it is on the East Coast. One of the critical things for the female CEOs we talked to was spouse support and their ability to be there and take up the slack when their career was taking off or they needed to go to a meeting or whatever it was. Interestingly enough, most of the female CEOs had professional husbands who had the ability to be flexible with their time. In a FIFO economy, how flexible can a husband be if he's out on site? And interestingly, it's not just the FIFO economy in terms of mining, it's all of the support sectors. People have to go out on site. It's also because of the distance in Perth. A lot of meetings you can't just fly down like I can fly to Sydney. I actually did it the other day. You just fly down to Sydney in the morning, you do your thing, you fly back that night, no problem. You cannot do that from Perth. You actually have to spend a day away, which means you're away from your children. Someone has to look after them. So if your husband has a role, a FIFO role, how do you do that? So there's obviously something going on with that second pillar. The third pillar, and again comes out in the female CEO study, is the role that grandparents play, both sides, the husband's parents and the female CEO's parents. At some stage, they usually step in and help out, if they're local. But if, like WA, you have a high proportion of people coming over to do work here, they don't bring their parents with them, they just bring their spouse and children with them. So that pillar's gone as well. And the fourth and final pillar is the flexibility. How flexible are organisations in providing part-time work? Is part-time even an option? And there are probably some really serious questions we need to ask, not just in WA, but as a country, around the degree to which we enable people, men and women, to have flexible roles to support their children. So all in all, what we're saying is there's a bit of a perfect storm in Western Australia in terms of the four pillars being absent. And those were the four pillars that really enabled the female CEOs from our first project to get ahead. So in terms of what business can do about getting serious about the issue, we had the opportunity to speak to some firms that have had some major successes around what they've done. And I think that's really just a summary. It's certainly far more difficult than I'm making out on this slide. But it has to start from the top. The board, the CEO and the executive have to get behind this and there be a genuine will to change. Without that, you're probably wasting your time. But that's not enough. We've seen lots of talk. We know the problems. It doesn't seem to change things by talking about it. So that's only the first step. The second thing is to actually understand what's going on in the organisation. Are there metrics around this? Are you measuring what the problem is? Do we even know how big the problem is and where people are situated and where we want them to go? So we have to do some measurement. The third thing is we have to understand what are the things that are getting in the way of progress on this issue. Are there processes? Are there systems? When we have flexible policies, are they being enacted? You know, a manager's doing one thing and we're saying another. Are people afraid to even take flexible options because of what happens to their career? We need to know those things and then we need to address them. And like any change management program, it is very, very difficult and there are short-term wins and there are some long-term cultural changes that we have to address. But they have to be embedded in the organisation. We have to set targets. There have to be goals. We have to say, okay, we know where we are, where do we need to be? And we have to set them in stone because if we don't, how do we set the next step, which is KPIs? How do we hold people accountable for reaching these goals? And I think you can do all of that, but if there aren't any real consequences for failure around KPIs and not actually getting there, then people don't take it seriously either. So, and during this entire process, even assuming all those things are there, I think the board and the CEO and the executive have a key role around being visible around the issue, continuously supporting the need for change and for driving this. It's just like any other change program. You have to do it. And what can women do? Well, there are certainly some things going on out there and some very consistent findings. We've interviewed 90 women from every range of position in Perth. And then added to that are the CEOs we interviewed from the first lot of research. And we've also gone now to graduates and included them in it. So we're talking probably 150 women who've been interviewed. I cannot recall an interview where confidence or self-confidence hasn't come up as an issue. It certainly came up with all of the female CEOs. So how does that play out? Well, if you're not confident enough to put your hand up for key assignments, or for understanding progress and seeing what can happen in terms of career progression. If you're not being visible and you're not, as Sheryl Sandberg puts it, leaning in, then how is anyone going to know that that's important? You need to actually put your hand up for the key assignments and you need to understand how progression happens in that firm. Progression is a social process. Yes, we have to be competent and we have to be great at what we do. But as I said, going right back to that slide with the circles, that's only the first step. The second step is other people have to know it. So you have to be aware of where the key associations are in the firm. Who are the key players? Who makes the decisions? Am I visible? Do they even know I exist? That's the second thing. And again, that's about leaning in and being visible, undertaking assignments, projects, speaking at functions, taking the roles others don't want to. You need to get sponsors and mentors very early. One of the things I didn't say early on is the things that boys get in their childhood, whether it's leading the school team, going out hiking and camping and everything else, they learn leadership lessons and they learn self-confidence lessons at school. Boys don't cry. That's part of them growing up. There's this mentality around self-sufficiency and about self-confidence that's driven into them. What sponsors and mentors were giving the female CEOs was that very stuff. The self-confidence and the leadership that they'd missed out in childhood. That's where they got it from. And you need to get it early so that you can put your hand up for the key assignments. You have to understand the key networks. And until we get to this world of gender equality, you need to understand how males socialise, which is really quite weird and different. And not understanding that actually does preclude you from those networks. It makes it very difficult. And it's true. As much as we don't like it, it is a lot about who you know, not so much what you know. I think that you need to understand and address and access those key networks. If you suspect you're being underpaid, address it. Ask, what is this person getting in my similar role? Do you even know? Do you even check? And then when you do know, do you negotiate? Men do that all the time. Men will say, oh, no, that's not good enough. I was offered something more last week. Whether it's true or not, but just do it. Something about being a male, I suppose. The double bind is critical, and I think sometimes the mistake is made of adopting male attributes or male ways of being a leader. I think it's a huge mistake. Certainly the female CEO has pointed to the fact that authenticity is critical. So what you need to do then is to find female role models, to find a female way of leading that works, not try and pretend to be something that you're not. It's one of the things about Australian society, we really hate people who aren't genuine, and they are punished. You won't progress. Discrimination's a tough one. It goes on, there's no doubt, as even speaking to the female grads that we have over the past couple of months, it's still going on in the workplace right now, and some of the stories that you hear are quite amazingly bad. But what do? Do you confront it? Because what's the penalty if you do confront it? Australia's terrible with whistleblowers. So it goes on. I think, not that I would be definitely holding myself accountable for this advice, but I would say by and large you have to make a judgment call. And nearly every woman I've spoken to has suffered indirect or direct discrimination, and they've said, oh, I just sort of let it float by, or I laugh, or I try and let it wash off. And I think, well, what's the alternative? If you confront it, often there's a greater penalty to pay for confronting it. So again, I sort of put that up there with that accessing networks. Until we get to a 50-50 world, there needs to be a degree of balance in how you approach that. Certainly, the worst cases of discrimination really always need to be reported, but other than that, you've got to make a call. I think you can, though, voice objection to stereotyping. Again, I can't count the number of women in senior roles where it's just automatically expected that they'll take the minutes or they'll pour the coffee. That's just obvious stereotyping that's easy to say, hey, no, why me? Get the juniors to do it or get someone else to do it, but I'm not doing it. And another thing that comes out of self-confidence is the one thing that we can't change, certainly not now until we get a bit more progressed with genetics, is that men can't have babies. So there will always be, to a degree, some societal pressure around you going to work rather than you staying at home with the children. And I think it's really a case of how is that rationalised? And I've heard probably 120-odd women tell me how that's rationalised, but it's something that they struggle with every day, that I should be at home with my children. That men seem to be able to rationalise a whole lot more easily, and that's because they're socialised to be able to do that. The question at the end of the day is who benefits? I mean, if you're going to work to provide your child or children with a better future, that's why the men are there. So why should it be any different? So when you've got aunts or grandmothers or mothers or even your husband's mum telling you, well, why are you going to work? And what about poor Johnny? well, you could be saying the same thing. Why is the husband going to work? What about poor Johnny? It should be a nice level playing field. Anyway, we've talked about 100 different things, and it's certainly not exhaustive. The report will go into all of this stuff in great detail. And the interrelationship of these things is what really causes the complexity and makes it so difficult to tackle. What's even worse is it varies from state to state, industry to industry, even firm to firm. And as I've found from interviewing people from the same firm, it even differs from business unit to business unit. So it's quite complex, but there's nothing here we don't know. It's not unfathomable, it's not insoluble, and we can actually do this and make a difference. So, questions?
Thank you, Terry. I'm sure you're all kind of got your ears pinned back at the moment. There was just so much ground to cover. Now, I'll let you know that the media are present. There's quite a big media storm, I think, going to be generated by this first stage of the findings, and then ultimately when the report is released next year. Now, one of the things that I like to do when I'm emceeing Q&A is to make sure that for every man that asks a question, we have a woman. For every young person, we have someone who's older. And I'd like to try and stick to a diversity of questions, not just the same types of things. So who's going first?
Hello, my name's Sarah De Freitas. I'm from Murdoch University. Thank you very much for a very insightful study, and I think there were a lot of lessons there for all of us to learn from. I'm quite interested, you didn't really touch upon it, but I was interested in the role that women can play for supporting other women. You did talk a little bit about mentoring. I'm actually a great believer in, kind of direct action in the sense that if, as women, we can actually work together, we can actually move things further forward rather than waiting for, somebody else to do it. Were there any findings from your study around the support of women, the inter-support of women, and do you think that that's something that could perhaps take us into a better place in WA?
Definitely. There's two sides to this. The first is very early on, I didn't ask questions about that idea of women supporting other women in the organisations. It wasn't a question that was in there. Until I came across a couple of female chairs who said, if you're speaking to so-and-so, ask her why she doesn't support women. And I thought, yeah, I'll do that. But actually it got to a point with some very senior women where I thought I was comfortable enough to ask. And the response was quite interesting. And that is that female CEOs, any CEO, it's just their current role. They're looking to their next CEO role. And a few of the senior women said to me, if I'm seen as being a gender advocate rather than a good CEO, I won't get my next role. So there was a fear of actually taking a progressive stance on it. So that's one side. On the other side, there's some terrific programs being implemented by some female CEOs around creating mentors. So they would send them away to actually professionally train them as being mentors, only on the proviso that then they would take 2 more, and those 2 would take 2 more. And so within a few years, they had 16 and then 32, and then the ability to, within a decade, have every female within the organisation mentored or role modelled by another female, which I thought was a terrific program. So there's 2 responses, and I don't know whether that answers the question, but... Yeah.
Now, there was a hand up from a woman over here, but I want a bloke. Come on, you blokes.
What happened in 2004? The pay equity gap got down to 14%. What happened before and after?
That's a really good question. I saw that graph. I was provided that, and the first question I asked myself was exactly that question. What happened? There were a few things happened. The work choices legislation, there was a Labor government, came in. To put this into perspective, I asked EOWA, and their honest response was, we don't really know, but we think X, Y, and Z. So one they said was work choices. The fact that when that was reversed, all of a sudden it went back up again. The second thing is that there is a correlation between what's going on in the resources sector. And one of the things I was looking for in the latest data was, is there a downturn in the gender pay gap now that the resources boom's come off? The answer is yes. In WA, the gender pay gap's declined again by about 1.7%. So I think the second factor is that there's a tie-in with well-paid industries that happen to be male-dominated. The third thing that they were trying to suggest, as it was tied in with what was going on globally. So what was happening in Norway and Sweden was occurring at that time too, and businesses were starting to pay attention. But then why would that account for it going up? I would have thought it would go down. So the truth is they don't know. We don't really know. But I think those two things have a fair bit of credibility to them.
Sue Doherty. Sorry, over here. Yep.
Dr. Joanne Samer, and I work in the private world, not in corporate, and never had a CEO role and don't aspire to. The question I have pertains to your second last slide, which was about self-confidence and self-esteem. And I was interested in the language you used, which is that we should do this and we should do that. And I'm wondering why we should do anything. Why is the responsibility back on us as women to forge our way forward through this quagmire?
That's a really good question. That's perfectly legitimate. Because there's two sides to every single thing I have said. Either we could change the entire corporate world, or we could change the people in it. And I think both, there's elements of both. Organisations do need to have a look at their selection and recruitment. If they're listening to the loud voices and appointing those that put their hands up and they're not even bothering to look at who else is in the organisation, then the organisation itself's suffering. But presently, again, and I can only go on the findings of what I'm being told, that's not what's going on in organisations. Most organisations have a social compact, if you like, that rewards those that put their hand up. So until that changes, the only way you can win is by putting your hand up too. But I totally agree that the organisations themselves are losing out by having that model. So I would preface what I said with, that's the way the world is, and I think I said it a couple of times. If the world were different, I wouldn't be saying this at all.
A man? Have we got a man? Come on, guys. You've been brave enough to come. You must be brave enough to put up your hands. Ray, I can always rely on you. Good boy.
Thanks very much, Ray Heron from Urbis. I suppose just in relation to the commentary that was around the importance of childcare in terms of, I suppose, addressing balance, which I know is a constant item of feedback that we receive as well. The whole notion of the paid parental leave versus directing resources towards childcare, is there any particular lessons to be taken from that from your study?
I think I probably simplified it by saying childcare. It's actually quite complex. There's the issue of 0 to 5 before they're in school, then there's infant school, then there's high school, so there's that equation. Then there's the mode of care. So I just talked about childcare as if it were childcare centres. But in fact, the vast majority of female CEOs and executives use au pairs, which is totally different to the East Coast, only because of the lack of flexibility of the other options. Before and after school care seems to be a major issue as well. So when I talk about childcare, we're talking about probably 15 different things rather than just childcare centres and rebating on childcare centres. We probably need to have a look at rebating all forms of childcare, including grandparents. But it's a massive issue, and I don't see the government's even anywhere near thinking that. I mean, they're struggling with this issue, let alone looking at the complexity and dealing with all the different forms of how we look after our kids. And a lot of that then ties into flexibility in the workplace and what employers can do as well. So I think that's just the very tip of the iceberg, that debate about what we do there.
Where are we next, girls?
Hello, Terry. Thank you very much. My name's Rabia Sadiq. I'm a lawyer, a speaker and an author, and I do quite a bit of work in resilience, leadership and diversity. I've got 2 questions, if I may, that are connected. Sorry, I'm being greedy. The first question is, did you do any work in your study in relation to government policy and legislation? Because in my humble opinion, in terms of the policy and the legislation, particularly as it relates to discrimination, I think we are a country that has very toothless legislation and a lack of policy in terms of consequences or sanctions for actions that relate to discrimination. So I'd be interested in whether your study covered that. And the second question relates to the Male Champions of Change. The Federal Sex Discrimination Commissioner, as you know, was pivotal in setting up the Male Champions of Change. Did you, in your study, look at any, if any, advocacy or sponsorship that is being conducted by an equivalent Male Champions of Change in Western Australia, given our dire situation?
So remind me the first part of the question, sorry.
Policy.
Policy, yep, thank you. I would totally agree with that. And that's why I sort of hedged around, because the proper advice you would think in a society is A, it shouldn't happen, and B, if it does happen, you should talk about it and do something about it. And if we had avenues to go through, whether it were government or whether it were internal, that you saw as being fair and equitable and there'd be no repercussions, you could. But nearly every woman I spoke to felt that they could not, that there would be sanction for actually raising this, and especially the milder forms where, oh, come on, don't you get the joke, or come on, you're taking this all too seriously, or it came straight back on them the moment they did anything. The hardcore stuff, I think, does get treated seriously, but it's right at the very end of the spectrum. So we do have a long way, but I think corporately, there's policies, or companies have these policies, but they're just not enacted and they're not supported at middle management level where this stuff goes on. I think that's what needs to change. The second part of the question?
Male Champions for Change.
A couple. And it's interesting, you know, that the firms that are having significant progress are those where the men are stepping up and saying we need to do something about this, where there's a genuine belief. They're not doing it for corporate bottom line, although I'd like to convince them that that's why they should be doing it as well. But they are actually addressing this and saying we need to do something, and you are seeing the shift in those firms.
And we should also acknowledge what's happening at the state level. So we've got our Equal Opportunities Commissioner here, Alana Lucas, and she's also got a CEO's forum that's got a couple of subcommittees working on some of these issues at a local level as well. A bloke, come on. Scott? No? Here, Wally Parsons. I'm making Holly run all over the room here.
Hi, Gareth Evans, Wally Parsons. 2 questions. Was there a trend in the women's leadership style of those who became CEOs? And if so, is there any form of training that can be put in place to support that? And secondly, is there any link between countries who have longer maternity leaves or support paternity leave that has narrowed that gender equality gap?
I don't know about the second question in terms of what's going on with maternity leave. Certainly countries that are more progressive in a suite of measures, Scandinavian countries, do have far more female participation. Sorry, the first question. What was the first question again? Leadership. Yeah, no, very similar, in fact. The male, let me say what the chairs were saying, what they were looking for, and then actually seeing the CEOs enact that. The chairs after Enron, HIH, OneTel, the dot-com bubble, were looking for transformational leaders. So they were sick of the heroic kind of leader that would lead them down the garden path. They were looking for inclusive, collaborative CEOs. And if you know the research, women are actually more transformation as leaders than men are. It was a pleasant surprise going in with expectations of expecting hubris and those kinds of things, not to encounter it at all. In 60 CEOs, male and female, very similar, collaborative, cooperative, inclusive leadership. They were about breaking down hierarchies and barriers, very similar kinds of leadership styles. Transformational leadership would sum it up. And that's what I saw, and that's what the chairs were after, so that much is happening. Mm.
And a gorgeous story from Wally Parsons International Women's Day, where I spoke on a panel, and this gorgeous engineer put up his picture with his wife, and he said, one of us has a first-class degree from Oxford and one of us has a second-class degree from a university you would have never heard of, and guess which one's got the first-class degree? And it was his wife. So that was really lovely. Up the back here.
Hello, Marion. Maxine Murray. I wanted to ask, is it possible to extend the research to ask the men in middle management, and especially in the senior management, why they don't speak up? I have experience, a long experience in this gender equity area, and in roles where it was my responsibility to speak up, so that was easy. But I find now, I've retired from those roles and I'm on boards, I am very tired of being what I call the organisational nag. the one who always raises the issue. And I'm just asking, can we find out why it is that the men don't ask the questions? Because we as women are just tired of being the organisational nag.
I don't know the answer in terms of research, but I do know that, again, boys are raised differently to girls. And you learn on the football field that you have to play as a team even with your weakest player. And so it's about supporting rather than criticising. And there's something, I guess, about male socialisation in those early years where they don't tend to pick or they don't tend to raise issue. I don't know why, and that's not based on research. It's just, again, you hear it over and over and over in the male CEOs. And you hear it from women and men. Men tend to not raise the hard issues at board meetings, whereas women tend to raise the hard issues at board meetings. There's something going on. There's no research that I know of that can answer that question, but it does, you're right about it being the case. And I suspect it's something to do with the way boys play together and the way girls play together.
And I think a number of the whistleblowers in those big corporate entities were women who were brave enough to talk out about the issue. So, and I understand it was a very unpleasant experience for them once they did speak out. Bloke. No, all right, we'll take a woman.
Marion, I can put on my deep voice.
Deep voice.
As best I can.
Alison was my economics lecturer in my MBA.
Alison Preston, I'm from the University of Western Australia. Terry, it's less of a question and more of a comment, and I would kick myself if I didn't stand up and make the comment. I appreciate when you do this research, it's a huge body of literature to try and get across, and that your focus has been on the leadership side. My own focus, as Marion said, is in economics, and I tend to look more at the institutional structures. In answer to one of the questions that was asked before about the gender pay gap, in the 1980s, women in Western Australia, all things equal, were actually paid more than their sisters nationally. And the main decline kicked in after the introduction of individual workplace agreements here in Western Australia, and the delays that came through legislation, and it never ever recovered after that. Another part of the work that we've been doing and trying to understand the gender pay gaps nationally and also in Western Australia. When you talk about women are underpaid and just ask, some of the qualitative work we've done has said, you know, well, do you ask for a pay increase? Yes, you can ask, but you risk being sacked. So another part of the institutional structure is the support that's there in terms of casual contracts, temporary contracts. And again, one of the other comments, does paid maternity leave work? Internationally, the evidence absolutely shows that having paid maternity leave schemes absolutely work to narrow the gender pay gap. Marion, before you go to a boy, can I please pass this to my new boss? No, she's saying no, but she won't get to say no.
Okay, so thank you. I'm really interested to know, it's two things. Sorry, Dawn Freshwater, University of Western Australia. It's about the relationship of your research to productivity. And I'm really interested that you chose habitus as the conceptual framework for the study, because of course within that we talk about narratives as well and the way in which we tell the story. So the first point is around the 4 pillars that you put up. I didn't hear anything said about this, but you might have picked that up when you were talking to people about the relationship of all of this to the fact that we're now, most of us, engaged in caring roles for elderly parents and the elderly population, the relation of that to productivity and the impact of that in terms of your work. But the other point I wanted to raise, I think, which is more interesting to me, you focused a lot on the way in which the women use networks, and you talked about them using the time that they gained from bringing in support for their domestic duties as being in maintaining networks. And I wonder if, in your experience, if that could be storied in a very positive way, because of course the research that's come out of Harvard, Boris Groysberg's work on chasing stars and the portability of talent, indicates quite clearly that women who use their networks to create opportunities for promotion and for career moves, their productivity increases by 5% immediately as soon as they make that move. Their male counterparts, and this is very black and white, and it's, of course, there's lots of grey, their male counterparts actually decrease in productivity because they often make those decisions differently, not based on the networks that they've created. So I think there's a way in which we can frame that story. And so some of what I'm hearing today is not necessarily about what we need to learn, but it's also about what we can teach.
Absolutely. I think in terms of the 4 pillars, that domestic role, I didn't actually say mother role, I used domestic role because it encompasses aged care, it encompasses social networking for the spouse and themselves, as well as childcare. And you're absolutely right, it's all of those things utilise their time and take away from time that could be spent generating capital. That's the first thing. In terms of the networking, I'm only really going on one of the key factors, and this is why I say it's complex, because it's all interrelated. Only 4 of the 30 female CEOs that I interviewed were industry appointments. That is, they had started within the industry and worked their way through the industry to become a CEO in that industry. 28 of the men were industry appointments. They'd done that traditional career path. That meant that those 26 other appointments were what I called context appointments. They were appointed through their network. They had become experts in mergers and acquisitions, or IPOs, or a particular product line, or whatever it was. They became known through their network for being an expert in that particular field, and then used that network, or in fact the network came to them and said, hey, we've got a problem that you're ideally suited for because we know you, and that's where they got to the role. So that's why I was focusing on that. If we were in an equal world, where you were able to progress equally, again, that kind of notion of networking wouldn't work anymore. It would be different. So, and I guess I come back to that comment before about why should women have to do this and why should women have to do that. That's the other side of the sword. I'm saying, well, this is where we are right now. If we're in a perfect world, the networking stuff that I just said wouldn't be the same. The advice in terms of self-confidence wouldn't be the same. But we live in this world, so what do we say to our daughters, and I have 2? Do you say, well, let's teach you or train you to be in the perfect world, which I think to some extent we do, or do we say this is the way it is at the moment, to succeed and progress at the moment, this is what you need to do? And that's a tough question.
Sure. At the back there.
You briefly touched on that there's only one female in the cabinet, the Liberal Party federally at the moment. And I think that's in large part due to the fact that the ALP has quotas in place for women being elected to winnable seats in Parliament. So it's clear from that example that quotas is a really good way of getting women into those positions. We know that women are just as capable as men. Do you think that that's something that we need to look at legislating in Australia in not only boards but I guess CEOs and just senior executive roles more generally, that we should be putting in place quotas for women?
The quota question. I think it's difficult to have a quota on CEOs. Quotas on boards worked, I guess, because boards are made up of a multiple, and so you can have a proportion of a multiple. That's not answering your question. The bottom line is, would Norway have gotten to 40% any other way? I'd pretty categorically say it wouldn't have. There is a massive, sorry, not massive, but there is a downside to quotas or affirmative action or any policy in which a woman is chosen because she's a woman. And the downside is, was I chosen because of my ability? And what are others thinking? Well, they're thinking you were chosen because you're a woman, not because of your ability. That's the negative side. The positive side is think back, or don't think back because none of us were alive, but if you go back to 1900 or 1895 and look at the newspapers about women getting the vote, it's a real eye-opener, because Australia was going to come to an end. If women get the vote, God knows what will happen to this country. Yet here we are, and it's unthinkable that we wouldn't have suffrage, universal suffrage. And I think we get caught up in this notion that we can't have quotas or we can't do that. Yet for our generation it would be a real pain. For business it would be a real pain. There would be suffering by both sides, men and women, about, did I get this role? There's this, it's unfair, it's unfair. But a generation from now, or perhaps closer to 2 or 3 generations from now, they'd look back and go, well, duh, why didn't you do that? What was going on in their minds? And so I think we have to take a step back and ask ourselves, are we at that point yet? I think the UK has probably got a better model, and that is targets with teeth. So actually firms saying, look, we're going to adopt a target, and now we're going to be held accountable for that target. Then perhaps if it didn't work, then we'd look at something else. But I don't know that we're at that point yet. Certainly business would resent it mightily, that kind of legislation going through. Would it work? Yes, it would, because it's legislation. You know, if the penalties were severe enough. But we'd need to be very cautious about how we did that. I think we probably should look at other models first.
Is there a man who has a burnt up question? No?
Hello.
Oh, Conrad.
Hello, Mary.
Conrad was our project coordinator right back at the beginning.
Yes, and hello, Terry. Just a quick question with the boys at the top that you were meeting with and discussing this sort of stuff with. At what point and why were they then becoming supportive of gender equality and women's leadership?
That's a good question. That's a very good question. In fact, I can share with you there were a couple of quite significant CEOs who were opposed to or were quite negative about A, the project, and B, the issue, and that this thing's been done to death, etc., etc., and that they were doing the best they possibly could. And it was really using a lot of this data and actually exploring, so sitting down one-on-one and saying, okay, you tell me what you think needs to happen, and I'll tell you what, if it's been done and why it works or why it doesn't. And we had this conversation where probably a half an hour of going through the issue, the pipeline issue. I can't tell you how many times I heard it'll be okay in a generation. It's just, you know, there's so many women coming out of university now, it'll be fine in 20 years. And then you say, well, hang on, no, 25, 30 years ago they were coming out in the same numbers, where are they now? So it's about dispelling each of these, I guess, myths out there about the issue and confronting them with hard facts, which is why we're doing the project, to actually say, well, no, it's not the pipeline. No, it's not about having the policies and procedures, it's about other things. So I think it's really about, if you could, ideally have a dialogue with every single decision maker, but that's very difficult to have.
Sure. And one of the things that I should tell you about is who Terry has spoken to. So he's spoken to chairs, both male and female, and CEOs, both male and female. And then we went through executive and senior women, and then into this young aspirants group, these sort of graduates. The group that cried the most was the opt-out group. And they had Victor, who is Terry's counterpart, who's a much softer guy, I reckon. And they were women who were incredibly frustrated and sad and bitter about lost opportunity. So, you know, we've been very careful not to just talk to women who are currently working, but women who for some reason are no longer in corporate life. And I think we've got a big body of wisdom from them as well. Okay, last question. I think we're just about at time. I can see Michael Schock pacing. Michael.
Thank you very
much. Sorry. I'll go to you, Michael, straight after the back there. Go on.
Hi, thank you. Christy Young from Diversity Network. I just wonder if, is there a general societal issue there that women may well be doing all that they can do, and I graduated 20 years ago as an engineer. Should there be more of a sharing between the breadwinner role and the caregiver role? And is it something that perhaps the men need to feel okay about it? Should they want to stay home for a while with the children? Is that then damaging their career? Does it go beyond just women? And why can the men not take up some of that too and actually be encouraged to do so? Would that improve things as well?
Absolutely, and in fact, the very first slide, the quote that I continue to use was from a male CEO, and he said, if men were to be mothers, there'd be a world of female CEOs. The reason I use that is exactly what you've just said, to try and say that we need to reframe this whole issue. It's not a women's issue at all. I mean, yes, it is, but it's about a greater picture. It's about as a society. And why don't men feel comfortable raising the children if their spouse has a better potential income? And men do, and Australian men do particularly. We're a masculine culture. If you look at the measures of masculinity and femininity in cultures, Australia is a masculine culture. So we penalise. Men are it's a bit strange for a guy to be at home looking after the kids while his wife's at work. Most people would agree that it's strange, and in fact, it's that social pressure that's causing a lot of this issue. So I totally agree with that comment, yeah.
And the men say it's quite difficult to break into mother's group. Holly, we just need a microphone down the front, please. And Michael, you get the last say.
Well, it's more an observation and a comment rather than any remark on what you've talked about this afternoon. I run an international executive search company. We've got an office in Perth, we've got one in Houston, we've got one in London. So we do a lot of work for public companies in all three of those areas. And I've been in the industry for 30 years, so a veteran, I guess you could say. And what I'm seeing at the moment is a very significant difference between what companies were doing, say, 15 or 20 years back, in their interest in recruiting women into senior positions, including boards. And in particular, what I've seen in recent years, say the last 5 or 6 years, is a very intense interest from major Australian listed companies to take women into their senior leadership roles. And these aren't token appointments. These are appointments in the $1, $2 and $3 million range. And boards and senior executives in Australia that I've seen, certainly in the US, and I've spent the last 8 weeks in Houston and time in the UK, I'm seeing a terrific and very positive and encouraging approach from companies in all three of those countries in ensuring that not only do women get the opportunity, but they're being paid at very senior levels that most men could only dream about actually earning in their life. And I can think of a couple, for example, in the $5 or $6 million earning capacity. And that's not what I had seen in years gone by. So I think Australia in particular, and maybe other Western countries, need to be complimented on the way in which they are endeavouring to put in place some of the things that you're commenting on and making observation on. And I guess in its broader sense, I would congratulate what's been happening at government level and what's been happening in public company life in Australia. So more just an observation from a practitioner in the industry.
And I hope my chairman doesn't mind sharing, but John Langelont, who's recently transitioned to a non-executive director career, tells me it's very hard to get a gig in this town at the moment because he doesn't wear a skirt. So things are changing. Michael Schott, could you please come and give the vote of thanks?
Thanks, Marion, and indeed thanks, Terry, for the work you've done today. It was a fantastic presentation today. I've seen variants of it several times thus far. It's always extremely engaging. If I can just maybe give you some background and some context to my own involvement. Yeah, in that coming into the project, we knew that the merits of the gender diversity issue were undeniable. Whether you viewed it as a social issue or a diversity issue or indeed an economic issue, or would it be a mix of all three? But we knew that we live in a country that doesn't shape up well vis-a-vis other OECD countries when it comes to gender diversity. And in turn, we live in a city that doesn't shape up against very well vis-a-vis Australia. So hence the importance of what Dr Fitzsimmons is leading for us. So the Filling the Pool project has had a qualitative approach in order to establish a real richness in understanding the how and the why of what is happening in our city. And in that endeavour, it's had an unrivalled access to the leaders in the local corporate and business community, thanks to our members within the Committee for Perth and indeed the assistance of both the AICD and CEDA. So Dr Fitzsimmons has shared some of the understanding with us today, and in 10 or so months, when the project reaches its conclusion, I look forward to Terry returning with a full understanding for us, including what we can do to address that imbalance. But prior to that time though, there is one action I'd like you to take away from today. So it's not often in Perth where you get to go to a corporate function and it's dominated by women, yeah, where the women outnumber the men. As and when that does happen, from my personal experience, it's always been associated with this discrete issue. There is one exception to that, and that was at the Committee for Perth annual chairman's luncheon of about 6 weeks ago. And of the 100 guests there, I think about 95 were men. And it was a fantastic, engaging and spirited discussion. But unfortunately, I think it's a reflection of the bias and engagement on the issue. Therefore, the action that I ask of you is to engage with one of your male colleagues, someone who you respect, someone who you know can be a change agent within your organisation, someone who gets the disconnect in the outcomes that we're achieving with regards the disconnect between the diversity issue, the value, the deeply held value, and the actual outcomes that we're getting. Someone who'd be horrified to be considered a misogynist, but when he looks around them, yeah, and looks in the cold, hard light of day, actually sees this big disconnect between value and outcome. So I put it to you, and for those of you that work in the resources industry, and particularly the oil and gas debate, yeah, safety was never a safety issue, it was a leadership issue, yeah. Gender diversity is not a gender diversity issue, it's actually a leadership issue. So as was put to me by my boss at the time, in a lady called Anne Pickard some 15 months ago, which was at the beginning of my engagement here, that nothing is really going to change until people like me step up into that space, yeah? And if not you, my nickname's Shocky, if not you, Shocky, then who? And if not now, then when? So thank you all for joining us today. Thank you for the Committee for Perth for hosting today's event, and thank you particularly for Terry. Really appreciate it.
Well, that concludes the formalities. I hope you've really enjoyed today. Watch this space. From this event, we've recorded it and we'll put out some event takeaways, so there's some key points arising, so you'll get that within the next sort of 48 hours. We'll keep you updated through the newsletter about what's happening with this project, and Terry's going to go away and have 2 months over a laptop, I think, preparing the first draft. Our steering committee meets tomorrow to consider the table of contents for that report. Already we've got some really meaty topics, so I look forward to that meeting, and we'll probably be meeting sort of October time to look at the first draft, and that's when we'll be coming back to many of you as individuals or heads of organisations to start socialising the recommendations. So lots of activity over the next wee while, and hopefully we're back in this room on the 1st of June next year to launch the report in full. Thank you.